All right, so I'm going to share my screen just to kind of show some things here. Share screen, this one. Okay, so yeah, what I am thinking we sort of start figuring out next is working with, a design that's already been thought out. So what I'm showing right now is just a free Photoshop template I found that, poses some interesting challenges that we'll be able to kind of use as a base and build out over the next little while. Now, speaking of designers, I think my main designer friend just joined. So, now he can design and after this be able to code it. So I'm going to be I'm not going to be very busy starting soon. So yeah, kind of look at this design here. Again, this is just one that I've found. There's some custom fonts being used here. There's interesting things like, right in the top left, having this in the nav, an image that's kind of stuck in in a funky spot. This is definitely a fun challenge that we will overcome. Having text aligned vertically, rotated, basically rotated. And yeah, there's a few sections here, and we can do some kind of stuff where this is basically a single page site. So it would be, when you click on something, it'll do that nice little scroll, animated scroll down. That will require a small JavaScript snippet, but that's just kind of a nice little finessing detail. We can, in HTML, you can scroll someone to a spot without any JavaScript, but it won't be animated. Yeah, got some stuff here. You see these blue lines, it's just kind of denoting the grid. Generally, a website's grid is broken into 12. I'm assuming, I didn't count, but I'm assuming this one's 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So yeah, 12 within the wrapper here. Some other stuff we'll be able to do when we get there is, this design is meant for, a wider screen, a desktop, maybe even a tablet. But we will eventually get into, okay, how do we handle things when it, when it cascades to a mobile size? Turning these sort of multi-columns into single columns is usually a good approach, among other things. So yeah, that's kind of what we are going to be working towards, something like this. Now, before we get into building this from scratch, I kind of want to show a bit of some sort of tools that we have that we can use to make a lot of this layout stuff a lot easier, rather than sort of floating and building things and thinking about the grid. There are a lot of resources that we can use. So I'm going to introduce you to something called Bootstrap. Bootstrap. So getbootstrap.com. Here we are. Let's see if we can see an example. So Bootstrap is basically a CSS, and it does have some JavaScript too. You don't have to use, but you can, and we probably will at some point. Bootstrap's basically has a bunch of pre-built components that are really easy to customize. So for instance, and we'll look at this really simple page. This is made in Bootstrap. So they've created, components for things like headers, things like these menus that open, buttons with all the different effects you can put on them and coloring. They have things for cards, inline buttons, lots of good stuff. That's just one example. That's, this seems like just core basic Bootstrap. They have stuff for like pricing, like this isn't actually the pricing of Bootstrap, it is free. This is just an example of something you could build with Bootstrap. Pull out my chat just in case anyone has a question. Oops, didn't mean to click on that one, but yeah, they have all the stuff for forms already looking nice. They have a bit of iconography. There's a lot of stuff. So usually most projects I do, I'd say these days, I use Bootstrap in some way. I don't, use every single piece, but definitely, I use it a lot for the layout, doing the columns and stuff like that. I use it for the buttons, and then you can very easily customize and override them. Yeah, lots of stuff. So we're going to go into the documentation here and do the quick start. So what I'm going to do is open my VS Code, and I have a project open already. So I'm just going to go file close folder. So then I get this nice thing, and we are going to make a new file. Oh, we already had a new file. So I'm going to, before I do anything, I'm going to save this file that I'm working on. It's just called untitled. And I'm going to go into my, where I've been doing these. And I'm going to make a thing called, let's just call this one Bootstrap. And we're going to call this index.html. So what I want to do now is tell VS Code, hey, I want this to be sort of my working directory. So if I open this, I'll see open folder. And I just want to, it'll bring me to where my last file was, so I can just click open. But basically, I'm selecting the folder that I want. And there we go. It does a little refresh. And now we have this here. So we'll get a little HTML going. Let's zoom. Inside here, I'm going to do the most basic Bootstrap website. So that's good for the, oh, we forgot a tag. We need a head tag. So title should be inside the head. And then we're going to have a body tag. And we're going to go hello world. And that. And as we've done a million times, we're going to reveal this in Finder. We're going to open it. And we're going to pull it over here. And there we go. We have our nice hello world website. Simple. Okay. So I'm at the Bootstrap documentation here, and it's essentially telling me what to do. Now, we could download the Bootstrap package and include it in here. But I'll show you real quick a simple way. Bootstrap has what's called a CDN, a content delivery network, that you can essentially include and host it from them. So I'm going to do that because it's much easier. And I'll paste it there. Let's make a little more room. I feel like that zoom is just going to be fine for us. So all I've done is include a CSS file. And this is a remote CSS file. So far, we've only been including CSS files locally. And when we refresh, it actually looks a little bit different now. And that's because Bootstrap CSS is doing a bunch of things for us. Now we're not making use of any of them other than it has its own sort of reset. It set a font to this default serif font. If you were to view our page source and click on this, we'd see that Bootstrap's CSS file is pretty big. And it's also really hard to read. And that's because it's minified. So minifying is something that you can do to your code, because CSS and HTML don't really care about white space and line breaks. So essentially when you run it through a minifier, it's getting rid of all that stuff it doesn't need. It's getting rid of comments other than the top comment, because that kind of is just showing like, hey, this is who made this thing and the license information and all that. So it's probably really hard to read, and not that you need to. And the reason it's minified is because the smaller the file size, the faster pages load. So it's very good practice to do. You can minify HTML, you can minify CSS, you can minify JavaScript. And the reason that's the reason it's minified. But if we wanted to look at this a little more in a nicer way, we can get rid of the .min in this URL here, just to give it a preview. And this is what is actually kind of going on here. So this looks a little more like CSS. But there's no point including this one because we might as well include the smaller one to make our page load faster. All right, and if we inspect our element here, we can kind of see what's happening. So our body, for instance, has, so these are just things that Bootstrap has put on. Margin 0 of the font family, to the size, all those kinds of things. So there we go. Okay, so what we might want to do is, let's go back to the Bootstrap documentation. So there's also some instructions that include the JavaScript. We're not going to worry about that right now. We might come back and do that. But yeah, let's do some stuff here. So let's play around with some of the things that Bootstrap automatically styles. So for instance, they're styling H1s. And you can see it's nice and big. We could do this and see what an H2 looks like. I bet you can guess it's just going to be that, but a bit smaller and so forth. They automatically are styling links. And it kind of looks this nice blue and has already a hover effect on it, not just the underline, but it does get a little bit darker. So that's some sort of default stuff for that. You'll notice, this is a trick, this is just a little thing I do sometimes when I don't feel like typing out a URL. You can put a number sign in href, and what that actually means is the same page. You see it just adds a number sign here. It's just a way to, because when you do an A tag without href, it actually won't render it like a link. It's now just text because it's like, hey, I expect it to be a link. Okay, I won't render a link. So just to see kind of what a link would look like without pasting a URL. There we go. So you'll notice that it's always stuck to the left-hand side here. So Bootstrap also has a class, and I believe it's called container. So there's a trick. There's a trick that I will, I've tried not to do. There's a lot of things I do that I try not to do on these streams because they might confuse people. But in VS Code and many code editors, you can actually, if you know you want a div with a certain class, you can actually just write .container, similar as if you're doing CSS, and then actually just hit tab. And that will create a div with the class of container, and it even puts your cursor right in the spot there, so you can start going. So I'm going to save that. So what this is doing, a container is kind of like that thing with that margin left, margin right, and a max width. So Bootstrap is saying the max width is 1140, but if we went through this, we'd see it's doing like a margin auto sort of thing. Yeah, margin right, margin left auto. It's not doing a margin right auto. I suppose you don't really need that because once you've said margin left auto, it's figuring it out, unless I'm missing something here. But so container is really nice. It's basically like a page wrapper. It means, you know, we're going to go 100% wide, but to a maximum amount. And I think container also just adds some padding too in Bootstrap. Okay, so let's look through here and let's I don't care about any of this stuff. Let's look at the components that they give. Yeah, we'll just start with the component. We'll just look through some of these. So I can just copy and paste this, and we're going to put everything inside a container just so it looks good. So over container, right, start, and if I go back here, I get this nice little alert. Cool. And Bootstrap has this convention. I don't know if so Bootstrap's, it's been around for a while. It was invented by Twitter, or created by Twitter. There's many other things, and I believe it was them that kind of started these certain conventions. I could be wrong. But what they'll do, and this is followed in many CSS frameworks now, is something might have a class, like a class of alert, but then it might have a secondary type of alert. And the way that's noted, rather than just going alert space primary, you actually do alert space alert dash primary. So it's kind of saying it's an alert. For instance, if I get rid of this, you'll see that some of the stuff will still be the same. It just doesn't have that nice color around it. But when I say it's an alert primary, that's what gives it the color. So we could change primary to secondary. We can change it to danger. So there's all these ones like primary, secondary. You'll see this in Bootstrap a lot. These are kind of like the main different things. Secondary success, so something positive. Danger is when it's, you know, maybe it's a button that is like delete, or an alert that's like an error. There's warning, which by default is yellow. There's info, and that's usually like, hey, I just wanted to provide you some info. It's, you don't have to do anything. They have one for light and they have one for dark. So let's do primary success, because we might have a message that says, yeah, whatever. We got this nice alert. Okay, so that's one thing. And they give you, and you know, we could go through these docs for days, but there's lots of things like, oh, you could put, if you want to put a link in here, specifically, don't just put a link with the class of alert link, and it will automatically then make it the right color. So that's actually like a dark green. If this was just a regular link, it's going to follow the normal links and it looks blue. But we want it to look nice. So yeah, the documentation is great because it also is kind of telling you like, it gives you the code that's great, but it also gives you a visual of what's happening. We'll skip over a few things. Oh, right. And they have basically a page for each type of component. So we'll keep the alert, why not? But let's look at a few other components that are used a lot. Buttons. Buttons are pretty awesome. So I'm just going to copy this guy and we'll put it down here and we'll refresh. There we go, we have a primary button and it's doing a lot of things under the hood. There's a little bit of a transition on it. There's also a bit of an effect when you push down, it gets just a little bit darker. It's hard to tell. That's really nice and similar to that. Look, it says primary. We could change this to danger and all of a sudden it's a red, a red button. So that's cool. Buttons are nice. And there's lots of, you can do like these outline style buttons. You can make them large, you can make them small. And a lot of the time it's just applying extra classes. So if I just add button large to this as another class, it makes it bigger, and small SM would do the same. You can make your buttons full width. Again, not going to show all them. You can also, buttons automatically, it also, this isn't a Bootstrap thing specifically, but they're styling and accounting for it. Buttons that are disabled, which is something we haven't even really talked about yet, it automatically kind of gives it a more faded out and it's not interactive, there's no effects. So they're accounting for all those things, stuff that is important for accessibility. So yeah, buttons, they have like button groups. So if you wanted buttons all next to each other, there's ways to you put them inside essentially a button group. You can align things, you can do them vertically, lots of stuff with buttons. Move on to cards. So cards are used a lot in web. It's usually when you have, especially when you have columns of things and you kind of have, it's usually like there's an image and then there's, some text, title, and usually some kind of call to action through a button. So I can grab this guy and we'll just put it right here. You'll see in their example, they just do source ... That is not going to work for us. So we actually need an image source. So we'll go to our best friend, place kitten, and we'll throw it here. And there we go. We got our card and we got a link and everything. So this is nice. And cards, I believe by default, I could be wrong, but no, okay. So by default, they do actually just, they're block level. They go on top of each other. So we'll eventually get to putting them side by side, actually very soon. So we have cards, they have things for carousels. So that's like doing these effects. I believe this one requires JavaScript, so we won't get into that. And by requires JavaScript doesn't mean you necessarily you don't have to write any JavaScript because they've already provided it. What else we got? Forms. So forms are a big thing. If I wanted a form, and I'm just going to copy this whole thing and I'll try and explain it quickly. And there we have a nice form. So essentially each row of your form is put inside a form group, class of a form group. You have a label. Now this label 4 equals this. We haven't talked about this. It's more an accessibility thing, and for screen readers, it's essentially a way to connect. Okay, this label is referencing this this input. So it's not required, but accessibility wise, it's a good practice. So they have that. They have they style this. There's a tag called small that we never talked about, but it's essentially just kind of like makes the text smaller by default. So that's why it's nice and tiny here. And they have this class for text muted. So a ton of really helpful things to put together a website really quickly. We haven't even done any CSS. All we've been doing is adding in these layers, these components. So we got forms. What else do they have? If you wanted a nice spinner, to indicate something is loading, yeah, just throw it in. There you go. Now this would not be good without using some kind of JavaScript. This is kind of useless because we don't have a way, if someone came to this site and this thing was just spinning, you're like, oh, I'm waiting for something to load. Nothing's ever going to load because we're just showing the icon. We would, we'd only want to show it when something's loading, which is a conversation for another time. So I'll remove that guy. So in short, lots of nice components. When I'm building sites, I usually completely use their forms because they handle so many great things, including like if you want to show this was, there's an error in this form, they handle that really nicely. It, works good on smaller screens. They have all that. So I definitely make use of forums, and I definitely make use of their buttons. I override a lot of the styles of them to match, a design, but I use them at their core, and it's nice. I use things like their alerts, their links. It's a lot of their basic stuff. I feel like very rarely I actually go in and use their modals, for instance, which are kind of like the pop-up things that come, because usually they're dependent on so many specific JavaScript things being included. And I won't, usually the carousels, I don't think I've ever used the Bootstrap carousel. Maybe it's good. I haven't made a carousel in a while because I feel like they're pretty outdated. So that's like one side of it, is their pre-made components. The other side that I do make use of a lot, and I think it's great, is their grid layout. So we kind of skipped over that. We just went right into components because that was kind of the fun stuff. But they have this whole thing called layout. And we've started using layout very quickly by just putting this container, which essentially kind of made things have a little bit of padding and have a max width. So let's see. I'm going to, just to make stuff easier, you know what, we're just going to save this file. I'm going to make a new file called grid, or let's call it layout.html. And I'm going to copy and paste a lot of the stuff that we already have. Close that container, close the body, close the HTML, and then just fix up my indentation here. Body, yeah. Just have something clean to work off of. And I could just go up here and change this URL to say layout.html. That's one way to get to it. And just to make sure we're on the right thing, we'll write something there. So we're good. Okay, so there's a lot to Bootstrap's layout, but essentially it helps us deal with things like columns and floating and not worrying about actually in custom CSS going like, we want this to be this wide. It works really well. And essentially what you do is you, inside a container, you make a class called row, div class equals row. And this might look familiar because even when I'm making my own styles for dealing with grid stuff, I like to still use this convention. And I'm going to give it a div class. I'm going to make inside the row a column, a COL. And I'm going to go hello world. And we'll just clean this up a little bit. Yeah, that looks fine. Save. So if we were to inspect this now, we're going to see, okay, I mean, nothing really special is happening here. We have a row and we have a column. Like, this isn't doing anything. But what happens when we have two columns? All of a sudden, it automatically figures out, and it's actually incredibly complicated CSS they're using to allow this to happen. It automatically goes, hey, there's two of me. So there's two columns in this row. So I'm going to make them each 50% wide. And we can, of course, prove that this trend continues by making 4. And we're seeing they're all going like this, and it's really nice. Column, 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 column. Okay, that's really cool. And that's just happening automatically. I didn't say what type of column it is. It just knows. So now we have 3 columns. Now, what if I wanted one of my columns to be really wide and the others not to be? So the convention they use is you still say column, but then after that you say column, and I'm going to write these and then I'm going to explain why these numbers, these magic numbers, make sense. Okay, so what's happening here is we have 1 wide column and 2 small columns. So in general CSS grids and in Bootstrap specifically, the standard on a website is 12. You have 12 layout columns. That doesn't mean like you're actually going to have like 12 columns of content, but the way you sort of divide your page into pieces is in 12ths. So what I'm essentially saying is every row is 12 columns. And when I'm setting this to 6, I'm basically saying use up 6 of those columns. Okay, use up 3 and use up 3. So I did a little bit of math behind the scenes to go 6 plus 3 plus 3 is 12. So I want these to still add to 12. And we'll see that this one, if we look at it, its max width is set to 50%, and these are 25 and these are 25. And we didn't write anywhere in our, we didn't even make any CSS. We didn't say anything like, oh, it should be, 25%. We essentially just said we want it to take up 3/12, 3/12, and 6/12, and it figured out all the stuff under the hood. I'm not going to go into their source code and be like, this is why that's happening, because there's no need right now. But as long as we know that there's 12 columns in our grid, we can do fun things like that. So we could have 6, we could have 3, and then essentially as soon as we, as soon as we get over that threshold of we've passed 12, it's not going to try and constrict them anymore. What it's actually going to do is start putting the next ones on the next line. So we essentially have 2 rows now, kind of like we have 2 rows of columns. This one is 50% wide, and the rest are going to be 25 because we're saying it's 3. 3 divided by 12, 25 is 0.25 or 25%. So this is nice. And it also deals with, I don't know if you remember, but we had that clear fixing issue at one point where, content after we finish doing things would start to overlap. It handles that all nicely. So you don't even have to think about it. We don't have to think about floating. Bootstrap's using something called flex instead of floating, which we talked about just a little bit in one example when we were doing the gallery. But yeah, we don't even need to know about it right now. But essentially, we can make columns like this. And this is really helpful because if we were designing something like this, say we wanted to make this guy here, and in fact, why don't we do that? Why don't we, since we're talking about columns, make this interesting layout happen? I just want to see if there's maybe a better example, something. I mean, this one's kind of a little bit straightforward. Let's just make an image. We'll just make an image grid ourselves with some, lovely place kittens. So I'm going to grab. We're going to make an image tag. I'm going to make these all just for now. Okay, let's just have one. And I'm even, for now, just going to get rid of that. We're going to start back at, okay, we just have a column. We're going to put an image source equal to this. And there we go. And we're going to put this in here. So one thing that is happening is the column is actually this wide, but the image is only, we only picked an image at 600 pixels. So images by default show up the size that they are. So what we can actually do here is give it a parameter width equals 100%, just so it fills its parent. There we go, we have a cat in one column. And as we start to add more cats, I feel like this is going to be a better demonstration than text because you'll see the contents a little bit more. We get them in these nice columns. And the columns automatically have like what are called gutters, so a little bit of padding on both sides so that things look nice and aren't touching each other. There are ways to override that, and we'll get there. So yeah, we can have this, and yeah, if we wanted one of our columns to actually be wider than the others, we can specifically say we want this one to be col 6, and it's basically now figuring out the rest. Now this will be funny because, oops, okay, so let's actually do, what we had before where we had col 3. So this is just going to lay them out like this, and that looks good. Now you might think as soon as I add another one, it's going to go in this nice little spot here. And that would be really nice if that was how, HTML worked. Unfortunately, it doesn't. We kind of have to think about layout a little bit differently. So what we're actually going to do now, if we wanted images to go here, which is kind of what I'm getting at, we have to think about this as a little more complicated than just columns inside rows. So inside a column, you can actually have another row, and then inside that row, you could have more columns. You can basically go as deep as you want. So what I will do here is our first column, this looks good, and we decide to make it big. What we're going to do is I'm just going to move these guys down. We'll use them as a reference, but we're going to make another column call 6. And all good there. And what we're going to do inside here is actually make a row. I'm going to do that trick where I do dot row and then tab. And inside here, we're going to make 2 more columns. And we'll pull those images that we liked. Oops. I'm just going to get this set up and then explain it in better detail. And we'll get rid of these guys. Let me just clean this up so it makes sense, and we'll give ourselves a little more space. So this, nothing changed. Even though we added quite a bit to the markup, nothing changed. So now, because we've essentially what we're doing, and if we inspect elements might be easier. So we have one big row, and inside it, there's 2 columns that are siblings to each other. But inside the second column, we have another row, and then inside that we have columns. So this actually allows us to continue to put more in here. And that will keep going just like that because it's contained within it. Now, if we did want to do what I'm getting at, where we kind of have a, this nice grid, if we set these all to say call -6, meaning take up half of my parent space because half of 12 is 6, we're going to start getting this nice sort of thing here. Now, this still isn't perfect. And the reason is as we're basically going column, and it's trying to put another one here and moving it here. So we have to think about this a little bit differently. We actually want another row. So I'm going to copy this row. And after our first row, I'm going to close it. And I'm going to pull these guys and do this. And that did not seem to work. Why? Does it just stop refreshing? That should have worked. So we have a row. We have a row. Okay, we will come back to this. Let's go back to the Bootstrap documentation real quick. So container, like there's not, well, I mean, let's start with container. We'll just go through this stuff. So we made a container, and that's essentially the thing that gave this a max width. So that things look really pretty. And you'll see it, still gets nice and gets smaller. There are other settings you can do on the container. You could, for instance, call it a container-fluid, and it works kind of the same, except it no longer has that max width. So we can make, really big cats, real big cats. And that's good for, certain things like a header that you might want to go across the whole screen regardless. But usually in content, we do want to set a max width at some point, so stuff doesn't become too difficult to read. Close you. All right, so we did the fluid one. All that's good. We're not going to worry about media queries yet. What else is in here? Okay, we're going to go into grid. Okay, so yeah, okay, so let's ignore the fact that these guys, there's not space above them. I'm pretty sure I can fix that pretty easily. I think, right, yeah, okay, now I know what we can talk about. Okay, so Bootstrap also has this lovely convention that you can use on pretty much any element. It's a class, and there's a few of them. One of them is essentially allows you to control the margin of things without writing CSS. So the way it works is you do M and then dash and you pick a number. I believe it goes from 0 to, I think maybe, I feel like only to 6. So what I'm gonna do is actually make it M2 here. And what basically happened is it added a margin on this root container of 2. Now that kind of broke everything because there was already a margin on it that did that lovely max width. So it's probably not a good idea to do that right on the container. So we'll find another spot to do that. The other thing is you can do similar with padding. So I can do P-2. And what that did, and just to show a difference, I'll do P0. P0, it's touching the edge. If I do like P5, it's adding it. So it's not, the number 5 doesn't represent 5 pixels. It means kind of like 5 units. And you can override in Bootstrap like what your default units are and what 1 equals. I think it's relevant to, let's find out. If we go P1, we can inspect. So 1 is a quarter REM. REM is a size that we have not really talked about. We've talked about pixels, we talked about percents. So REM CSS. Right. So now I remember we did talk about EMs, and EMs or Ms are relevant to the font size that you are of that component. So if you had a font size of 14 pixels and you said 1 REM, it's basically converting that to 14 pixels. That's with EMs. REMs are the same, except they're based off your base font. So if I all of a sudden, made a quick style tag and did style, font size, I think it's probably set to I have to say on my body. Actually, let's do it on my HTML because that's really my root. So make the font size 14 pixels, nothing's changing. Make it 20. You can see it gets a little bit bigger. So I'm essentially setting my font size, and then all of Bootstrap's calculations of padding, gutters, all that kind of stuff is relative to that, which is really nice because your font size, even though you've set it, a user can always change it just by when you're like zooming in and zooming out. So Bootstrap is automatically, and that was just me doing, I don't know how to do it through the browser, but Command- to zoom, Command+. So the good thing about REMs is it is, relative to that, it respects, if someone has on their device accessibility feature for font size, all of a sudden, like we can still make stuff look good and be relative to that. So you don't have like this huge font, a little picture. So essentially what I'm getting at here is P1 and is a quarter of whatever your font size is. Whereas if we looked at P4 and refresh here, P4 is 1.5. I'm assuming P3. So anytime you have a M3, a P3, it's equal to whatever your font size is. So this essentially should be 14 pixels if we measured it, give or take. So that's really helpful because we can just add, instead of adding a CSS style to specific things and say, I want some padding on that, we can just do an HTML, and that's usually really helpful. I'm going to make, let's actually keep that, P3. And what that did is it added padding top, padding left, padding right, and padding bottom. What if we just wanted to do padding left, for instance? Well, we can do PL3. This is just their convention. Again, if you're joining later, the only reason these conventions exist is because we have Bootstrap being used in this project. You can't just do this in HTML and expect the same results. So what happened there is it all moved back up, and that's because we no longer are talking about padding top, and stuff probably got shifted to the left a little bit. So stuff's getting shifted to the left, but not to the right. Set this back to 0, and we'll see that's really what it by default looks like. So we can do that with L, we can do that with R, we can do that with T, and we can do that with B. And the B, we won't be able to notice anything because there's nothing under it. So that's top, left, bottom, right. And again, just having P essentially adds it to all of them. Padding 0 everywhere. Let's do 5. 2. Now you can also do things like, we might want to have a PL of 2 and a PT of 6. Okay, 6 is too much. Maybe 5 is the max. 5 is the max, so it goes from 0 to 5. It's good things to know. So what's happening here is we're saying there's a padding left of 2 and there's a padding top of 5, and we could keep going and do whatever we want. One other shortcut we could do is, say we wanted to add padding to the left and the right. Of course, we could do PR and PL at the same time, and that's adding a bit of padding there. But this is a little bit annoying because I want these to be the same. So they have an extra class we can use, which is PX. And all PX means, it's basically saying the X-axis
axis. So like think on a graph, there's a y-axis and an x-axis. X is left and right, y is up and down. So we can say px2, and it's actually going to add it's adding padding left and padding right. And we can see that by inspecting and going to our container and seeing, oh, px3 padding left, px3 padding right. So sweet, that's a nice thing. And same thing for the y-axis. We can do py, and that'll basically do padding and padding. So that's super helpful. It also, everything I showed you for P works for M exactly the same way. So I might have, a py3 here, but maybe on this specific image, I could give it a class and say, you know what, mt2. And that's going to shift this guy down a bit, mt5. And same kind of thing, we can also do just M, and we'll get padding, we'll get margin on all sides, all that kind of stuff. Great, so it's good. So the reason I'm showing this, I believe, is because we want a bit of space between here. So what I'm going to do is go to the second row, and inside its class tag, let's give it a mt of, let's just try 1 just to see if it works. There we go. We got a nice little 1. I bet if we make this like a 5, that's a little too much. Trial and error here. 3. Let's try 4. 4 is close. We'd have to tinker and probably write our own custom CSS if we wanted these to line up, perfectly. But this looks fine to me. We're good. Okay, so that's all good. Now, and as we shrink, things shrink. Bootstrap's automatically using what are called media queries, which we'll be talking about in a minute, to gracefully kind of set these different breakpoints so that things continue to look good. But I think on mobile, having this as having this in this sort of fashion where it doesn't, this to me should kind of go to 2 columns. It's not ideal. So we're going to talk about how to handle that. And Bootstrap has a great solution similar to what we've been seeing. What I'm going to do is simplify the work we've done, because there's a lot going on here. We have a lot of inheritance, a lot of things inside other things. So let's just simplify this just so I can show this a bit better. I'm going to get rid of, what I'm going to do is copy this guy. And I'm going to get rid of everything else we did. I know, it's all gone. I'm sorry. Rewind the video if you want to see it again. Just so we can show the idea of, okay, 2 cats. And the reason that they are half and half is because we've said they're both in columns of 6, and the images themselves are set to 100% so that they, fit nicely. And what I want to show is how can we make this go to a 2-column, a single column layout at a certain size. So I'm going to, before I explain it, write the code, because I want to make sure I do it right before I explain the wrong thing. I believe this is correct. Almost, right. They've changed to they reversed to a mobile app. So, okay. I'm going to put these back. And we're just back to nothing. We're going to add the column classes again. Okay. So the reason I was doing it that way is back in the day, the convention was build your site for desktop, big screen, so that was normal. And then, oh, these phones came around, so we need to make like hacks to make it work on the phone, and we'll override stuff when it's a small screen size. And that convention worked great until we kind of got to the point where it's like, oh, everyone is coming to websites for the first time on their phone anyways, and sometimes just exclusively on their phone. I've seen analytics on websites I've done, and it's obvious, like everyone has a smartphone, and they're not sitting at a big computer and all those kinds of things. So the convention in both design and development is build mobile first, and then override for bigger screens. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to set these to call 12s. And what that does is it's essentially saying, hey, put it the full width, because 12 divided by 12 is 1. So it's 1, when we say call 12, we're saying take up 12 of those columns that we have and do the whole thing.
And then what I want to do is actually override, and I might mix up the markup here. So let me test it before I explain it. Excellent. Yep. Okay. So we have this single column layout because by default, and we're building for mobile first, we're like, hey, we want this to be, take up 12. But what I'm doing here is call -md-6. And what MD is, it's saying medium, it's medium-sized screens. I want it actually to be 6. So that's why you see when we eventually hit a threshold, it actually goes to this 2-column layout. I'm going to add one more actually. No, you know what? 2 more. Let's have 4 guys. So we got these four beautiful cats. This will work the same way. We're at 1, and when we get to a certain threshold, it basically is saying, you know what, these guys are going to go to 6. But what happens if we get to an even bigger size? We might want to turn it to a even larger layout. So we can just do call MD. Sorry, we did MD. So now let's try. I think it's LG. And we want this maybe to be 3 when we get to this size. So we're still at 2. Oops, my mistake. There we go. So 1, and then we reach a certain size, and boom. So that's when we're in the MD range, the medium-sized screen. This would be like a tablet or maybe even a big Android, like a larger Android phone. They're pretty big. And then eventually when we hit that large screen size, we're putting it in 3s. So 3 divided by 12 is 4. That's why there's 4 columns. And then if we, let's just add a couple more to really put the point home. So again, if I save right now, we're doing this, and it's going to continue to do that. But if we made, call, I think the next one is XLG. It could just be XL. Let's try XL first, and then we'll fix it. And we'll say 2 here. I'm just going to paste these guys in. I might have, nope, I did get the right one. So there we go. So, we're saying, okay, we want columns. We want them to be by default 12. But when we hit that medium-sized screen, which essentially comes into play there, just after just getting close to 760 pixels, I think, we go to we're going to make use of 6 of our things. Each column is now 3 in the large area, and each column is 2, and so on and so forth. So it's really helpful because honestly, without using something like Bootstrap to handle columns and stuff, it's a lot of CSS, and usually stuff ends up being janky. I've written stuff like this before, and it's worked, but even it's just a lot of work. It's a lot to maintain. Bootstrap and other CSS libraries really have it figured out. So yeah, I like this, and yeah, recently they did change it to sort of a mobile up approach. So you're overriding things bigger, and that's why we did it that way. So when you are building your own website, start from mobile up, because that's what everyone's doing now, and that's what the libraries are built to do. So yeah, we kind of looked into that, and this was that whole like SM. Let me see if there's anything important that I didn't miss. So this is where we're doing like the MD4s and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff here if you want to do offsetting and things like that. We're not going to get into that. I find it's this works and it's good. Like you can do these like justify classes and that kind of stuff, but no need to get into it now. Yeah, so that's kind of that's Bootstrap. So what I was kind of talking about before is there are ways to override how many columns you're using. Like 12 is the default. What is your base gutter width? You can change those breakpoints. So this is actually telling me, okay, the default, which is what we started with, the breakpoint is basically saying anywhere between 0 pixels and 576 is considered the excess. Anything between this and this is small. Medium is 768 to this, and so on and so forth. So those are overridable. You can't just paste this into a CSS file though. There's something that essentially Bootstrap is built in something called Sass, which is a way to write CSS with a bit of extra functionality, which so we're not going to talk about that now because it does require some extra setup. But we will eventually get there because honestly, I don't, other than in these tutorials, I haven't written like straight up CSS in a long time because Sass just does a lot of awesome extra things for you that like things like variables like this. But it's good to still be able to consult this and see what are these sizes. Okay, so that's kind of a bit about grid. We talked a bit about the layout stuff. We went through some of these components and we made, we showed this layout. And I think, showing this really fundamental stuff is super important. I brought this up at the start of our lesson today. And I bet already, you could kind of give some thought now where you see, okay, and especially with I've turned on these grid layers, you can see, okay, we'd probably, have a row and we put it in a column that has a size of, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like taking up 5 instead of 6. Or we might even just do 6 and do something to this text so that it breaks. But it seems like this is, very easily just doing 5. Whereas this one right here is also 5. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, did I miss one? Do they have their whole? Yeah. Anyways, you can kind of imagine, and then like stuff like this, like, okay, these are obviously taking up 3. So a lot of the times, design files are following something to this nature too, so that when you build it, it doesn't look different because the 12 works really well. And like here, like, we would have a row, we would have 2 columns, one would have the image in it, one would start to have all this text, and then we'd break out of the row and we'd, have this nice button. So we're not gonna, we only got a few minutes left, so we're not gonna get started on this design. I may also spend some time looking, like, I think this might be a good thing to do, but I might find a different design that has similar challenges to what the points I'm trying to get across over the next little bit. But I think this was, even if we don't end up designing this and design something different, like this was a good, I think, reference to then show things where Bootstrap is going to come in handy. All right. I think we're at a good place, to call it a day, because the next thing I would do is we'd, be starting and making this project, but starting that now and only having like 3 minutes is, I'd have to just review it anyways. So we're not going to worry about that now. Instead, let's see if there's any other cool Bootstrap model we can, Bootstrap component we could include in our thing. What one is cool? Sure. Actually, no, I know what we want to do. Where's the header these days? What? Drop down collapse card. Did I miss a whole thing? Typography, code, images, components. Since I've been on this these docs, they definitely changed a bit. Oh, navs, right? It's not called a header. Let's add a nav, and we'll just do that to the page we've been working on. So what I'm going to do, even before we have that main container, and I'm just going to keep this real simple and copy this and paste it here and go back here. And look, we have a nav, and you'll notice because we didn't put in the container, it's going to take the full width, which is fine. Let's do some fun stuff to this. I think there's ways to make it prettier. Nav bar. This is what I actually want. This is what I actually meant to paste in. This is better for a top nav. So I'm just going to paste this whole thing in, and I'll quickly explain some of it. There we go. Look at that. We have a beautiful header on our site. It has things like it has a thing for drop down, but it hasn't been configured. It has a search. Their search thing automatically puts this nice X in here that will clear it for you. All that without JavaScript. I'm actually surprised. How the heck do they do that? How do they do that without JavaScript? Did I secretly include JavaScript? Or maybe it's something built into
browser now. Placeholder search. Sorry, I'm just curious right now. There's a button that submits that. No, that's that button. Form control. Type search. Okay, so maybe I'm just going to change this to text. I'm pretty sure that I guess browsers by default, when you create a search, will put in an X for you now. That's cool. We can prove that by, I'm going to turn off Bootstrap completely and let's just see. Oh, wow, look. So we have no CSS. I didn't realize that you could make it, that you could do this. See, I learned stuff still. Cool. So yeah, no JavaScript even required for that, which is nice. So yeah, we have this header, we have some links, we have sort of stuff. Obviously, you know, we would have links to our different pages on our site here. And there's a lot of extra things we can do. We can make it fixed so that when you scroll, it, you know, kind of stays put. All that stuff. This, you know, you make this link to your homepage, all that fun stuff. And I believe just by default, yep. So the nav bar automatically, the Bootstrap one, when you get to certain screen size, it actually changes to this other menu. Now, this doesn't work. I think there's a small JavaScript snippet, or at least including the Bootstrap JavaScript would be needed to do that. And that's something we'll do if and when we need to. But, you know, the most things I don't use a lot of the JavaScript on Bootstrap. I, you know, sort of stick to their CSS components because I don't want it to conflict with other stuff I'm doing. But nonetheless, yeah, this is good. We talked about layout, we talked about whatever. What did we talk about? The components. And yeah, next we're going to actually start building something. We're going to use Bootstrap, you know, as the base to deal with these, you know, these layout issues and stuff that's usually hard to do from scratch, while overriding certain things about it so it doesn't just look like another Bootstrap website. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Hope you guys enjoyed your time, and we'll catch you at the next class tomorrow. All right, take care.